The hour before you sleep. Somewhere in this house, or the one beside it, a light is still on. You do not need to know whose. It is enough to know that you are not the only person awake at this hour, and that being awake at this hour is not a failure of any kind. It is simply the part of the day when the useful work is finished and the mind, having nothing left to organize, turns and begins to look at itself. That is what we are going to do tonight, though we are going to do it slowly, and we are going to do it through the life of one man who lived 500 years ago and who was very bad at resting. His name will come later. For now, only this. He was 24 years old. He was in a city that was not his own. He had finished a piece of work, and the work was already being admired, and the admiration was going to somebody else. We are going to sit with that for 4 hours. Not because it is dramatic. It is not especially dramatic. Nobody dies in the first part of this story, and nothing is destroyed. A young man hears something in a church on an ordinary afternoon, and that evening he does something small and slightly shameful, and then he spends the following 65 years not doing it again. That is the whole shape of it. A small act and a very long silence afterward. I want to say something about how to listen to this. You do not have to follow it. If you lose the thread in chapter 9 and find it again in chapter 30, nothing has gone wrong. The chapters are built to be entered from anywhere. Each one holds its own small room. If you fall asleep in the middle of a sentence about marble, that is the correct outcome, and the sentence will still be there, and it does not mind. There will be dates in this. There will be a certain number of names. I am not telling you them so that you will remember them. I am telling you them because a life is made of particular things, and a story with no particular things in it is a kind of fog, and fog does not settle a mind. Detail settles a mind. The specific weight of a specific block of stone quarried in a specific year settles a mind in a way that a general remark about art never will. So there will be details. Let them go past you like stations. One more thing before we begin. This is a story about a man who wanted very badly on one particular night for somebody to know that he was the one who had done it, and then who appears to have been so embarrassed by that wanting that he never permitted himself to do it again. I think most people know that feeling from the inside, not the marble part, the other part, the part where you did the work and somebody else got the nod, and you said nothing, and you went home, and it sat in your chest all evening like a swallowed stone. You do not have to do anything with that tonight. You are not being asked to resolve it. We are only going to look at how one man handled it badly once and then differently for the rest of his life. The room is dark. The lamp is out or nearly out. Your part in this is finished. Let your breathing get slower than the sentences. Chapter 2. Rome at night in the year 1499. There is an old church in Rome, on the far side of the river, in the part of the city that clusters around the tomb of St. Peter. In 1499, it was not the building you would picture if you have seen it since. The great basilica we know now had not been built. The old church that stood there was more than 1,000 years old, and it was falling down. Its walls leaned. Its floor was uneven, with the tombs of the dead set into it. It was cold in the way that only very old stone buildings are cold, which is not a cold that comes from the air, but a cold that comes up out of the ground and sits in your feet. Inside it, in a side chapel, there was a new thing. It was a sculpture in white marble, slightly larger than life, of a seated woman holding the body of a grown man across her lap. It had been in place for a very short time. The marble was so recently finished that it still had the particular quality of a polished surface that no dust has yet settled into. It caught what light there was and gave a little of it back. People had begun to come and look at it. This is the scene. Hold it for a moment, because we will come back to it more than once tonight, and each time we come back you will know a little more about how it got there. An old church leaning, a chapel off to one side, a new white shape in the dark, and in the evening, after the visitors have gone and the doors are shut, a young man letting himself in with a light. He is not a thief. He has every right to be there in one sense and no right at all in another. What he is about to do is not a crime, and it is not quite proper either. It occupies the narrow space between those two things, which is the space where most of the interesting human actions live. He is carrying an oil lamp, not a candle. A small, shallow clay or bronze vessel with oil in it and a wick coming out of one end, which gives a low, unsteady flame about the size of a thumbnail and which will not illuminate a room. It will illuminate about as much as your hand can cover. He also has tools with him. Consider what it means to bring tools. A person who is going to look at something brings only himself. A person who brings a chisel has already decided. He would have had to cross the city in the dark to get there. Rome in 1499 was not a large city by our standards, perhaps 40,000 people, but it was an unlit one, and it had a reputation. There were parts of it where the ancient ruins had become quarries, and other parts where they had become housing. Cattle grazed in the old forum. It was a city living inside the enormous broken shell of a much greater city, and at night the shell was very dark. He crossed it anyway. He got to the church, and he got inside, and he went to the chapel where his own work stood, and he set the lamp down where it would throw light across the front of the figure, and he looked at it. We will get to what he did next. We are in no hurry. Chapter 3. What he had heard that afternoon. The account we have of why he went comes from a man named Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the first real history of Italian art about 50 years afterward, and who knew our sculptor personally in his old age. Vasari is not a perfect source. He liked a good story, and he was writing partly to praise. Historians have caught him arranging things. But he was there, in the sense that he was in the same rooms as the man himself. And where he tells us something small and unflattering, it is usually worth taking seriously, because there was no advantage to him in inventing it. What Vasari tells us is this. A group of visitors from Lombardy, which is the north, around Milan, came into the chapel to see the new sculpture. They stood in front of it and admired it. And one of them said, with confidence, that it was the work of a sculptor from Milan. They named the man Cristoforo Solari, known as Il Gobbo the Hunchback. A real sculptor, a competent one, not a nobody, which somehow makes it worse. If they had attributed it to a fool, the young man could have laughed, and the young man was standing there. That is the whole of the incident. There was no argument. He did not step forward and correct them. He did not say, "In fact, that is mine." As far as we know, he said nothing at all. He stood in the chapel and listened to a group of strangers give away the best thing he had ever made. And then he went outside into the afternoon. I want to slow down here, because this is the hinge of the entire night, and it is very easy to pass over it as a piece of anecdote. Think about the particular shape of that humiliation. It is not that he was insulted. Nobody insulted him. The visitors were being complimentary. They were in fact saying that the work was excellent. They simply attached the excellence to the wrong man in his hearing and walked on. There is a specific kind of loneliness in being praised in the third person by people who do not know you are in the room. You are simultaneously the most present person there and the only one who does not exist. And he could have spoken. That is the part that would have kept me awake if it had been me. The correction was available. It would have taken 4 words. Some people would have said them easily, and the whole thing would have dissolved into laughter and apology and probably a pleasant conversation. He did not say them. We do not know why. He was 24, and he was already known to be difficult, and he was in a foreign city where his position was not yet secure. Perhaps it seemed undignified. Perhaps the words did not arrive in time, which is what usually happens. Perhaps he was simply not the kind of man who could stand in front of strangers and claim a thing out loud. But you notice what happened instead. The thing he could not say to their faces in daylight, he went back and said to the marble in the dark. That is not nothing. That is a whole personality, visible in a single evening. Chapter 4. The Chisel and the Sash. The sculpture has a detail that most people do not notice because they are looking at the faces. Across the front of the seated woman, running diagonally from her left shoulder down across her breast, there is a band of cloth, a strap. It holds her robe in place. In marble, it reads as a smooth ribbon, about as wide as 3 fingers, standing slightly proud of the surface behind it. It is the only flat, uninterrupted, uncomplicated surface on the entire front of the work. Everything else is drapery, which means it is a landscape of folds and shadows. The 2 bodies are anatomy. The bases are rock. The sash is the one place where a person could put a straight line of letters and have them be legible. He had carved that sash himself months before, without any of this in mind, and now it was the only place available. I think about that more than I should. The instrument of the confession was already built into the work. He did not have to add anything or take anything away. The surface was waiting. So he set the lamp where it would rake across the marble. This matters technically, and it is worth a moment. When you carve letters into stone, you cut a V-shaped channel, deeper in the middle, sloping out to the surface on both sides. Such a channel is nearly invisible under flat light from the front. Under light coming from the side, low and hard, one wall of every channel goes bright and the other goes black, and the letters leap out of the stone. Which means that a man carving letters at night by a single low lamp is actually working under better conditions than a man carving them at noon. The lamp is not a limitation. For this one task, the lamp is the correct tool. He would have used a flat chisel, quite small, and a light hammer, and he would have worked slowly because marble does not forgive. Wood can be filled. Paint can be painted over. Marble is subtractive and permanent. Every strike removes something that cannot be put back. If you slip, the slip is now part of the work forever, and the only remedy is to remove more stone until the error is gone, which means the letters get deeper and cruder, and eventually you have ruined the sash. He did not slip. He cut, by the accounts, through the night. One line of Roman capitals, running the length of the band, each letter perhaps the width of a fingernail, each one requiring dozens of small controlled strikes. Picture the sound, because the sound is the strangest part. A very old church, entirely empty, the doors shut, the city dark outside. And in it, hour after hour, a small, regular, high tapping, metal on stone. Not loud, loud enough to carry in that space and to come back off the walls a half-second later. Nobody heard it, or nobody who heard it came. And at some point before morning the letters were finished and he blew out the lamp and went home. Chapter 5. What he cut into the marble. The letters he cut read, in the Latin of the time, and with the V standing where we would put a U, Michelangelos, Bonarotfes, Florentimes, FACIEBAT. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, was making this. There is the name. I have been withholding it for 4 chapters, and now you have it, and now the whole thing rearranges itself in your mind, because it is not an anonymous young man anymore. It is him. The one whose name you already knew before this recording started. But hold the name for a second and look at the last word, because the last word is where the interesting thing is hiding. FACIEBAT. That is not the ordinary way to sign a work. The ordinary way would have been FACIT, which means made it. Finished, completed, done. A fact in the past. Michelangelo Buonarroti made this. FACIEBAT is a different tense. It is the imperfect. And the imperfect in Latin describes an action that was ongoing, continuous, in progress, was making, was in the middle of making, had not finished making. This was not his invention, and he was not being careless. There was a known convention behind it. Pliny the Elder, writing his natural history in the 1st century, recorded that the greatest artists of ancient Greece signed their works in exactly this way. Apelles, the painter. Polykleitos, the sculptor. They used the imperfect deliberately, Pliny says, as though the work was still unfinished and still capable of being improved, so that if the piece were criticized, they might be understood to have been interrupted rather than to have failed. It was a formula of modesty. possibly false modesty, certainly a very sophisticated one. So on the same night that a young man crept into a church to claim his work out of pure wounded vanity, he chose a form of words which said in effect, "This is not finished, I could have done better, I make no final claim." Both of those things are on the sash at once. The vanity and the retreat from the vanity cut into the same 3 inches of stone in the same hours of the same night. I find that almost unbearably human. He also gave 3 facts and no more. Given name, family name, city. No title, no patron, no date, no dedication, no prayer. Just, this is who I am, and this is where I am from. And the word Florentine is doing quiet work there too. He was in Rome, he was a foreigner. He had been described as a Milanese. So the middle of his correction is not really about the sculpture at all. It is about not being from here and being taken for someone from somewhere else. Florentinus, I am not one of yours. I am from Florence, and in Florence they would have known. That is a man defending his identity, not his invoice. Chapter 6. And then he never did it again. He lived another 65 years. Let me put that in scale, because the number goes past too easily. He carved the letters in 1499. He died in 1564 at 88 years old, which was an extraordinary age for the period, and which meant he outlived nearly everyone who had ever known him as a young man. In those 65 years he made the David, he painted the ceiling of the Sistine chapel, and, 30 years after that, painted the wall behind its altar. He carved the Moses, he carved the slaves, and left them half emerged from their blocks. He designed a library and a chapel and a city square. He became, at 72, the architect of the new St. Peter's and worked at it without pay until the last months of his life. He signed none of it, not one. Not a name, not initials, not a mark in a corner. The most recognizable artistic personality in the history of Europe, a man whose handwriting survives in hundreds of letters and whose contracts and accounts and grocery lists we still have, put his name on exactly one object in 88 years and then stopped. The tradition, which comes to us through Vasari, is that he regretted it, that having done it, he was ashamed of the impulse that had made him do it, and resolved never to be caught by that impulse again. We should be careful. That is a tidy explanation, and tidy explanations about the inner lives of the dead deserve suspicion. It is also possible that the fashion changed, or that later works had no convenient sash, or that a man who is already the most famous artist alive has no practical need of a label. But the practical explanations do not really cover it. He had 65 years and hundreds of opportunities, and a documented streak of pride wide enough to quarrel with 2 popes. Something stopped him. Something about that night stayed with him as a thing not to be repeated. And here is what I want to leave you with, before we go back to the beginning of his life and come forward slowly. The most famous signature in the history of art is famous for being the only one. Its meaning does not come from the letters, it comes from the 65 years of blank stone that follow it. He is not remembered as the man who signed the Pieta. He is remembered as the man who signed the Pieta once, and then thought better of wanting to be known, and spent the rest of a very long life letting the work stand there with nobody's name on it at all. We are going to spend the next 4 hours finding out what kind of person does that. We will go back to a hill town in Tuscany in the spring of 1475, and a child handed to a stonecutter's wife, and a father who thought the whole business was beneath the family. There is no hurry. Nothing that follows requires you to be awake for it. Chapter 7. Caprese, the 6th of March, 1475. There is a village in the eastern hills of Tuscany, up where the land stops being gentle and starts being serious, near the headwaters of the Tiber, Caprese. It is small now, and it was smaller then. Florence, which governed that region, used to send out minor officials to run its outlying districts. They were posted for 6 months at a time. The position was called podesta, and it carried a title and very little money, and it was the kind of job given to men from good families who had run short of options. In the winter of 1474, a Florentine named Lodovico di Leonardo Buonarroti Simoni took up the post at Caprese. He brought his wife, Francesca, who was pregnant. On the 6th of March, 1475, in the official residence, she gave birth to their second son. They named him Michelangelo. Lodovico wrote the birth down in his private record book, as heads of households did, with the date and the hour and the names of the witnesses. That entry survives. It is one of the very few completely unglamorous documents at the beginning of a famous life, and it is worth pausing on for that reason. At the moment it was written, it recorded nothing but an ordinary event in an ordinary family having a moderately difficult decade. The family mattered to Lodovico enormously. That is the thing to understand about him. The Buonarroti Simoni were old Florentine stock. They had been in the city for generations. They had at various points held minor civic offices, which in Florence was the marker of belonging. They were not merchants of the first rank, they were not bankers, they had no palace. But they were, in their own estimation, gentlemen. And they were sliding. The money had gone or was going. The land holdings were modest and getting more modest. Lodovico spent his life in a state of anxious, slightly querulous dignity, taking small posts, worrying about property, and reminding his sons of what the family had been. There are letters from him later, when Michelangelo was the most celebrated artist in Italy, and they are still mostly about money and property and grievance. This is the household. A father with a name he cannot afford, and a very sharp sense of the difference between the sort of work a gentleman does and the sort he does not. Keep that in your mind, because in about 13 years it is going to collide with a boy who wants to be a stonecutter, and the collision is going to be violent. The posting at Caprese ended a few weeks after the birth. The family went back down to Florence and to the small property they held at Settignano, in the hills just outside the city walls. And that is where the first strange and useful thing happens. Chapter 8. The Stonecutter's Wife. It was normal, in a family of that class, not to nurse your own infant. The baby was given to a wet nurse, usually a countrywoman, often for a year or two, sometimes longer. At Settignano, the Buonarroti had property, and the village had a trade. The hills there are full of a grey-blue sandstone called Pietra Serena, the stone that Florence is largely built out of. And Settignano was a village of quarrymen and stonecutters. It had been for centuries. Half the men in it worked stone, and their fathers had worked stone. The woman they gave Michelangelo to was the daughter of a stonecutter and the wife of another. So the child spent his infancy in a house where the tools were part of the furniture, where the men came home with dust in the creases of their hands, where the sound of iron on stone from the yards up the hill was simply the sound the world made during the day. Late in his life, he made a joke about this to Vasari, who wrote it down. The joke was that along with his nurse's milk, he had taken in the chisels and the hammer with which he made his figures. I want to be careful here because this line has been repeated so often that it has hardened into something like destiny, and it was not that. It was a witticism from an old man about his own origins, made in company, probably not for the first time. Men who have become famous develop a small stock of these. But jokes are not nothing either. People do not make the same joke for 50 years about something they consider unimportant. Under the wit there is a real claim, and the claim is this: I did not choose stone, I was placed in it before I could choose anything, and there is something in that which is worth turning over slowly at this hour. Most of what determines a life arrives before consent, where you were put, what sounds were normal, what kind of hands the adults around you had, whether the people who raised you made things or sold things or argued about things. None of it was decided by you, and all of it is now in you. So deep that it does not feel like influence, it feels like temperament. He would spend his whole life insisting on his gentle birth, correcting people who called him a craftsman, signing his letters as a Florentine gentleman, keeping a careful distance from the guild of stonemasons. And he had the hands of Settignano. The nurse's house also gave him something else, harder to name. He was away from his mother. He came back to a family and a mother he had, in the most physical sense, not been with. Whatever that does to a very small child, it was done. 6 years later, she was dead. Chapter 9. The mother who died when he was 6. Francesca died in 1481. Michelangelo was 6 years old. She was in her mid-20s. We know essentially nothing else. There is no account of the illness, no description of her, no portrait, no letter in her hand. She is a name in a family record and a date, of the woman who bore 5 sons and died before the second one was 7. History has kept the fact and thrown away the person. He never wrote about her. In all the surviving letters, all the poems, all the reported conversation of a man who lived to 88 and talked a great deal, there is no passage about his mother that has come down to us. I am going to resist doing the obvious thing here. The obvious thing is to point at the sculpture in the church in Rome, the one from the first chapters, and say, a young woman holding a dead son, made by a man whose mother died when he was 6. There it is. There is your explanation. That reading is very old and very tempting, and it may even contain something true, but it is not knowledge, and I do not want to hand you a guess dressed up as a fact at 1 in the morning. He did not say it. Nobody who knew him recorded him saying it. It is a pattern we can see from outside, and patterns seen from outside are frequently our own. What can be said, without inventing anything, is smaller and I think more useful. A boy of 6 loses his mother. His father is a man with a difficult temper and an anxious relationship to status. There are 4 brothers, 1 older and 3 younger, and the household is under financial strain. The boy is sent, or goes, back and forth between the townhouse and the property at Settignano. Out of that comes a man who was famously solitary, who worked alone, refused most assistance, and drove away the ones he accepted, who ate badly, on purpose, bread and wine at his bench, who slept in his clothes and his boots, sometimes for so long that when he finally pulled the boots off, the skin came with them, which Condivi records with some distaste, who had a great capacity for intense attachment at a distance through letters and poems, and much less capacity for it in a room. Nothing in that list requires the mother to explain it. But the list is what we have, and the loss is in the same life. And I will simply set the two beside each other and leave them there. He kept all his life an extreme and consuming loyalty to the family that remained. He supported his father and his brothers financially for decades, bought them property, bailed them out, and complained bitterly the entire time in letters that are still exhausting to read. He fought with them constantly and never once cut them loose. That is also a shape a person can be pressed into by an early absence. Hold on to what is left, resent it, hold on anyway. Chapter 10. Sculptors Are Laborers. Around the age of 10, Michelangelo was put into a school in Florence to learn Latin grammar, which was the standard preparation for the kind of respectable life Lodovico wanted for him. He did not do the work. He drew instead. He drew in the margins of the grammar. He went to churches and drew what was on the walls. He made friends with boys who were apprenticed in painters' workshops and went with them and drew there. This went on for 2 or 3 years, and the reports coming back to his father got worse. Lodovico's response was to beat him. This is stated plainly by both of the men who wrote his life while he was still alive to correct them. Ascanio Condivi, who was his own student and wrote the version Michelangelo effectively supervised, says that the boy was often beaten by his father and his uncles. Vasari says the same. It was not a single incident. It was the family's sustained position on the question. We should not read this through modern eyes as unusual cruelty. Beating a child was ordinary correction in 15th century Italy, and nobody involved would have thought it remarkable. What is remarkable is the reason. They were not beating him for laziness, he was not idle, he was working extremely hard at the wrong thing. They were beating him for wanting to enter a trade. Here is the distinction that mattered so much to Lodovico, and it takes a moment to reconstruct because it has entirely vanished. A painter in 1488 was a member of a guild. He ran a shop. He signed contracts, employed apprentices, priced work by the square braccio and by the cost of the pigment. It was a business, like being a goldsmith or a good tailor. Slightly better than manual labor, not much. A sculptor was worse. Sculpture was physical. You worked with your body and you came home dirty. In the ancient argument, the Italians called the paragon the comparison of the arts. This was the standard charge against sculpture, and Leonardo da Vinci made it with real contempt. The sculptor is covered in marble dust and looks like a baker, while the painter sits at his ease, well-dressed, listening to music. To a man whose entire remaining capital was the family's claim to gentility, a son who wanted to swing a hammer for money was not pursuing a calling. He was announcing the family's descent, in public, permanently. And the son would not stop. Eventually, sometime around his 13th year, Lodovico gave in. It is not clear whether he was worn down or persuaded or simply decided the boy was useless for anything else. In April of 1488, he took Michelangelo to the workshop of the most successful painter in Florence and signed him up as an apprentice for 3 years. Chapter 11. Ghirlandaio's Workshop. Domenico Ghirlandaio ran the biggest and busiest painting operation in the city. He was not a revolutionary, he was something rarer and more commercially valuable, completely reliable. He delivered enormous fresco cycles on time, full of accurate portraits of the Florentine families who had paid for them, set in beautifully observed rooms and streets. His work is calm, crowded, secular in feeling even when the subject is sacred, and technically immaculate. When Michelangelo arrived, the shop was in the middle of the largest commission of Ghirlandaio's life, the frescoes in the choir of Santa Maria Novella, which took years and involved the whole workshop. The apprenticeship contract is unusual and worth knowing about. Normally, an apprentice's family paid the master for the training. In this case, Ghirlandaio agreed to pay the boy. A small sum rising over 3 years. That is not a courtesy. Workshops did not pay 13-year-olds out of kindness. It means that whatever Lodovico brought through that door, Ghirlandaio looked at it and decided it was worth money. What the boy would have learned there is the entire practical foundation of the rest of his life, and it was not inspiration, it was procedure. How to grind and mix pigments, how to prepare a wall, how to make the cartoon, the full-size drawing, and transfer it by pricking the outlines and pouncing charcoal dust through the holes. How much wet plaster to lay down for one day's work, because in true fresco, the paint bonds chemically into the plaster as it dries, and you must finish that patch that day or cut it out. Fresco is the least forgiving painting technique there is. It is fast, it is irreversible, and it must be planned in advance in enormous detail. You cannot correct it. You can only chisel out the day's plaster and start again. 20 years later, on a scaffold in the Vatican, that training is going to matter more than anything else he ever learned. He stayed about a year, not 3. The relationship, by all accounts, was not warm. Condivi's version, which is Michelangelo's own, is dismissive of Ghirlandaio and claims he learned nothing there and was resented for his talent. Vasari's version is more balanced. There is a story that the boy corrected a drawing by an older apprentice, and the corrected sheet survives, and it is, in fact, an astonishing thing for a 14-year-old to have done. He was, plainly, difficult from the start, difficult and correct, which is the worst combination to be around. And painting was not the point. He had gone in wanting stone. Chapter 12. The Garden at San Marco. In 1489, roughly, he left the painters and got into something much stranger. Lorenzo de' Medici, who effectively ruled Florence, had a collection of ancient sculpture. Marble fragments, torsos, heads, sarcophagi, the sort of material that came out of the ground whenever anyone in Italy dug a foundation. He kept a good deal of it in a garden near the monastery of San Marco. He had installed there an old sculptor named Bertoldo di Giovanni, who had himself been a pupil of Donatello, and a small number of promising young men were given access to study the antiquities. This was not an academy. Later accounts inflated it into one, and historians have spent a long time deflating it again. There was no curriculum and no enrollment. It was a collection, a caretaker who knew a great deal, and a handful of youths permitted to be there. But consider what that access meant. Every workshop in Florence taught the current manner. In that garden, a boy could put his hands on the actual thing, Roman marble, and behind it the Greek, the whole vanished technical achievement of the ancient world lying around in pieces among the trees. He copied. There is a marble faun's head associated with this period, now lost, and the famous anecdote attached to it from Vasari. Lorenzo came by, looked at the boy's copy of an old faun, and remarked mildly that an old man would not have kept all his teeth. Michelangelo knocked one out and drilled the gum to look receded. Lorenzo was delighted. Whether or not it happened exactly so, the story tells you what the household valued and what the boy was like. Correction accepted instantly, executed drastically, over-executed slightly. 2 works survive from these years, and they are startling for a teenager. A relief called the Madonna of the Stairs, very shallow in the difficult flattened carving Donatello had invented. And the Battle of the Centaurs, a knot of struggling naked bodies, unfinished, which he kept in his own house for his entire life. He kept it. 70 years, through every move, in every house, a rough marble panel he had made before he was 18. Condivi says he told him that when he looked at it, he realized what he had lost by not devoting himself entirely to sculpture. And then the thing that made all of it possible arrived. Chapter 13. 2 years in the house of the Medici. Lorenzo took him into the palace to live. This is the fact that separates Michelangelo from nearly every other artist of the period, and it happened when he was about 15. He was given a room. He ate at the family table. Contemporary accounts say he was seated according to whoever arrived first, without regard to rank, which means an adolescent stonecutter's apprentice sat among cardinals' sons and heads of banking houses as though the question of precedence did not arise. He was given an allowance. Condivi says 5 ducats a month and a cloak. At that table, in those years, were the people running the intellectual life of Europe. Marsilio Ficino, who had translated the whole of Plato into Latin and was constructing an elaborate synthesis of Platonic philosophy and Christian theology, Angelo Poliziano, the finest Latin poet of the age. Pico della Mirandola, who at 23 had proposed to defend 900 theses on everything and written the Oration on the Dignity of Man. A boy of 15 sat and listened to these men argue over dinner every night for something like 2 years. You can see the result across the whole of the later work, and it is the reason his sculpture does not look like anyone else's. The core Platonic idea, as Ficino taught it, is that the visible world is a degraded copy of a realm of perfect forms, and that beauty in a body is a trace of that higher order showing through matter, and that the soul, recognizing it, is drawn upward. Human love is the bottom rung of a ladder that ends in the divine. Now hold that against a man whose job is to remove stone. He came to describe carving in exactly those terms. The figure is already inside the block, complete, and the sculptor's work is not to invent it, but to take away the excess and release what was always there. He wrote it into his poetry decades later, as plainly as it can be put. That is Ficino's metaphysics translated directly into a manual operation. The form exists, the matter obscures it. The work is subtraction. It also explains something about the unfinished pieces we will come to much later, the ones where a torso strains out of raw rock. Under that theory, an unfinished figure is not an abandoned figure. It is a figure caught in the act of emerging. The failure to complete becomes a statement about the condition of being embodied at all. He was 15, and he had been handed the philosophical frame he would use for 73 more years. In April of 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici died. He was 43. Michelangelo was 17. He left the palace and went back to his father's house, and the world he had been living in began, over the following 2 years, to come apart entirely. Chapter 14. The Fist of Pietro Torrigiano. There is a physical fact about Michelangelo that everyone who met him noticed, and that no portrait lets you forget. His nose was broken and badly set, flattened across the bridge, pushed off center. In every likeness we have of him from life it is there, and it changes the whole face, turning what might have been a fine-boned head into something blunt and slightly damaged. It happened when he was about 17, and we know who did it because the man who did it bragged about it for the rest of his life. Pietro Torrigiano was another young sculptor in the Medici circle. Same garden, same access, same ambitions, a few years older. He went on to a substantial career and ended up in England, where he made the tomb of Henry VII in Westminster Abbey, which is still there and is a very fine thing. Decades after the event, in Florence, Torrigiano told the story to the goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini, who wrote it into his own autobiography. Cellini is at least as unreliable as Vasari and enjoyed himself even more while writing, but this passage has the ring of a man reporting something he found disgusting. Torrigiano's account, as Cellini gives it, is roughly this. They were young men drawing in the Brancacci chapel, copying the frescoes of Masaccio, which was standard training. Michelangelo had a habit of mocking whoever else was working. He mocked Torrigiano. Torrigiano got angry and hit him in the nose so hard he felt the bone and cartilage give under his knuckles like a biscuit and marked him for life. And Cellini says that he himself conceived such a hatred for Torrigiano at that moment, hearing him boast of having disfigured Michelangelo, that he refused to go to England with him. Torrigiano was banished from Florence for it. Now, two things. The first is about what the blow tells us about the boy. Nobody punches a 17-year-old in the face over nothing. The account from a hostile witness is that he was sarcastic, relentless, and unable to keep it to himself. Every other source, friendly and unfriendly, across 70 years, agrees on this trait. He was extremely hard to be around. He said the cutting thing. He could not say it. The second is about what a permanently changed face does to a person. He was surrounded, professionally and intellectually, by beauty as a doctrine. He was living in the household where Ficino was teaching that physical beauty is the visible trace of divine order. His own art would become the most sustained study of the idealized human body since antiquity. He carved perfect noses for 60 years, and he had this one. I want to be careful again. It is far too neat to say he spent his life making beautiful bodies because his own face was broken. People are not equations, but there is a documented thread. In his poetry, which we have in quantity, he returns repeatedly to his own ugliness, sometimes with self-mockery, sometimes with real bitterness. It was not a thing he had made peace with and forgotten. It stayed available to him as a wound for 70 years. He was 17, he could not stop being clever at other people's expense, and he paid for it with his face, permanently, in public, and every single person who ever looked at him afterward saw the bill. Chapter 15. Savonarola and a city that changed its mind. While the boy was being formed, the city was preparing to lose its nerve. Girolamo Savonarola was a Dominican friar from Ferrara, prior of the monastery of San Marco, the same San Marco whose garden held the Medici marbles. He was not a charismatic figure to look at. He was small, ugly, with a large hooked nose and a harsh voice. And he emptied every other church in Florence. What he preached was simple, and it was terrifying, and, crucially, it turned out to be partly right. He said the church was corrupt, that Florence was drowning in luxury and vanity and sodomy and usury, that God's patience had run out, and that a scourge was coming over the mountains to punish Italy. In 1494, Charles VIII of France came over the mountains with an army. Understand what that does to a population. A man has been standing in a pulpit for years saying an invasion is coming as divine punishment, and then an invasion comes. Whatever you thought of him on Monday, on Tuesday, you are listening. The Medici had by then passed to Lorenzo's son Pietro, who was not his father. Pietro went out to negotiate with the French, gave away far more than he was authorized to give, came back and found the city had finished with him. The family was expelled in November 1494. Florence became a republic again, and in practice, for 4 years, it became Savonarola's. He instituted the reforms: gambling banned, swearing punished, dress regulated. He organized bands of boys who went house to house collecting objects of vanity. And in the carnival seasons of 1497 and 1498, they built pyramids of those objects in the Piazza della Signoria and burned them. Mirrors, cosmetics, fine clothes, playing cards and dice, musical instruments, books, including manuscripts of the classical poets, and paintings, some of them by living artists. The painter Botticelli, who had made the Birth of Venus, is said to have brought his own works to the fire. That is the bonfire of the vanities, and it happened in the square that Michelangelo had grown up crossing, and it burned exactly the culture that had raised him. Where was he for all this? Gone, mostly. He left Florence in October 1494, just before the Medici fell. Condivi says he was warned by a dream, which is the kind of detail Michelangelo liked to supply about himself in old age. The likelier version is that a young man who had lived in the Medici palace and eaten at the Medici table could read a room and got out before the room turned. He went north to Bologna, but he did not forget the friar. Condivi says that in his old age, 60 years later, Michelangelo could still remember the sound of Savonarola's voice, and that he still read his sermons. That is the tension that runs under the whole life. He was formed by Platonic philosophers who taught that the beauty of the body leads the soul to God, and by a friar who taught that beauty is a snare and the world is about to be judged. He never chose between them. He carried both, unreconciled, into everything he made, and in his last 30 years, the friar slowly won. Chapter 16, Bologna and the Nights of Reading Aloud. He was 19 and effectively a refugee in a city where he knew nobody. He was taken in by a Bolognese gentleman named Gianfrancesco Aldrovandi, who gave him a room in his house for about a year. Condivi records the arrangement, and it is one of the small details I find most affecting in the whole life. Aldrovandi liked poetry. Michelangelo had a good Tuscan accent, which the Bolognese admired. So in the evenings the young sculptor read aloud to his host from Dante and Petrarch and Boccaccio, and that was, in part, how he paid for his lodging. Sit with that image for a moment, because it is a quiet one, and it belongs to this hour. A house in Bologna, in the winter of 1494. A man who has lost his patron, his city, and his position, reading Dante out loud to a stranger who took him in, because that is what he has to offer. He knew the Divine Comedy nearly by heart. This is well documented. He quoted it his whole life, drew from it, wrote poems about Dante, and considered him the supreme figure in Italian culture. When you look later at the Last Judgment, with its ferryman and its damned, you are looking at a man who had been reading that poem for 50 years. He also he got a commission to finish the tomb of St. Dominic in the church of San Domenico, which had been left incomplete by 2 dead sculptors before him. He carved 3 small figures for it, an angel holding a candlestick and 2 saints. They are still there. You can stand in front of them. The angel in particular is not what you expect. It is compact, muscular, heavy in the shoulders, kneeling under the weight of what it holds. Beside it stands an earlier angel by another sculptor, all delicacy and fluttering ribbon. And the contrast is instructive. One of them is decorating a tomb, and the other one is carrying something. He was 19 and already unable to make a light thing. And he was in Bologna, which meant he was looking at the work of Jacopo della Quercia, whose reliefs on the doorway of the Basilica of San Petronio are full of huge, simply massed, physically overwhelming figures. 15 years later, on the Sistine ceiling, the figure of Eve being created has an unmistakable family resemblance to Jacopo's. Nothing is wasted. A young man is driven out of his city by a political collapse, lands in a stranger's house, reads poetry for his supper, and picks up, on the way, the visual vocabulary he will use to paint the most famous ceiling in the world. Chapter 17. The Sleeping Cupid and a Fraud That Worked. He came back to Florence in 1495, into the Republic, into Savonarola's city, and there was very little work. And then he made the piece that got him to Rome, and it was a forgery. Here is what happened, as Condivi and Vasari both tell it, differing only in the details of who was to blame. He carved a small marble Cupid, asleep. Somebody, and the sources argue about whether it was Michelangelo's idea or his dealer's, observed that if the thing looked ancient, it would fetch several times the price. The market for antiquities in Rome was enormous and completely unregulated, and a genuine classical sculpture was worth a fortune, while a modern one by an unknown 20-year-old was worth very little. So the Cupid was aged, buried in acidic earth, by the usual account, to corrode the surface and give it the pitting and staining of centuries. It was shipped to Rome and sold through a middleman to Cardinal Raffaele Riario, one of the great collectors, for a good sum. The middleman kept most of it. Michelangelo, by Condivi's account, received about 30 ducats out of a sale of 200. Then the Cardinal found out. He sent an agent to Florence to investigate. The agent found the young sculptor. And here the story becomes interesting. Rather than being run out of town, Michelangelo was invited to Rome. Think about the logic of that. The Cardinal had been defrauded, but the object had passed as ancient in front of the best eyes in Rome. A young man in Florence had made a thing that the most sophisticated collectors of the age could not distinguish from the classical work they revered above all else. That is not a scandal. From a certain angle, that is the most impressive credential in Europe. The Cardinal got his money back from the dealer and brought the forger to Rome. Michelangelo arrived in June of 1496. He was 21. The Cupid itself is lost, burned, or destroyed at some point after passing into the English royal collection. I want to note one thing before we move on, because it will matter in a few chapters. His entry into Rome, the city where he would make his name, was made possible by an object with somebody else's name implicitly on it. A work of his own hands passed off as another man's. 3 years later, in a church in that same city, a group of tourists would attribute his greatest work so far to a sculptor from Milan, and he would go out into the night with a chisel. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how easily a name comes unstuck from an object. Chapter 18. Rome and the failure before the success. The first Roman years were not a triumph. The cardinal who had brought him there gave him a commission and then, by all accounts, lost interest. Michelangelo carved a Bacchus, a life-size marble of the god of wine, and Riario appears to have rejected it or simply declined to take it. The Bacchus is a genuinely strange object and worth 2 minutes. The god stands unsteadily, holding a cup up and slightly off balance. His weight shifted, his eyes unfocused, his mouth a little open. The body is soft. Not fat, but slack, without the tension you expect, the flesh of someone who does not work. Behind him, a small satyr child eats stolen grapes. It is a sculpture of a drunk. Every other treatment of the subject in that era gives you a handsome young god. Michelangelo gives you a figure whose muscles have gone loose and whose balance is genuinely in question, so that you look at the marble and feel, physically, that it might topple. At 21, he was already doing the thing that would define him, refusing the pleasant version and putting the actual body in. It ended up in the garden of a Roman banker named Jacopo Galli, displayed among genuine antiquities and, by some accounts, with its hand deliberately broken to make it look excavated. There is a drawing by a Dutch artist from a few decades later showing it standing there with the hand missing. So, rejected, absorbed into a private garden, disguised again as an antique. 22 years old, in a foreign city, one patron cooled, one major work quietly sidelined. He wrote home, as he would for the rest of his life, and the letters from these years are full of money and complaint. But Jacopo Galli, the banker, had bought the Bacchus and liked the young man. And Galli knew a French cardinal who wanted something for his own funeral chapel. In August of 1498, a contract was drawn up, and Jacopo Galli personally guaranteed it, putting his own credit behind the promise that this young Florentine would deliver. The contract said that Michelangelo would make a Pieta, a virgin holding the dead Christ, in marble, life-size, within 1 year. And Galli added a clause. He wrote that it would be the most beautiful work in marble that exists in Rome today, and that no living master could do better. That is an extraordinary thing to put in a legal document about a 23-year-old with one rejected sculpture behind him. Chapter 19. The cardinal who wanted something for his tomb. The man paying was Jean de Billers de la Graule, a French cardinal abbot of Saint-Denis, and the French king's ambassador to the Holy See. He was old and in poor health, and he was arranging his own funeral chapel, which was ordinary practice. What he wanted was not ordinary in Italy, though it was entirely familiar to him. The subject he specified, a seated virgin holding the dead body of her son across her knees, was a northern European form. In Germany, it was called the Vesper build. In France, the Pieta. They were common in the north and often small, carved in wood, and frequently harrowing on purpose. The body stiff and angular, the wounds emphasized, the mother's face contorted. The point of those objects was to make you feel it. They were devotional aids for private grief. and they did not spare you. In Italy, the subject was much rarer. The Italian tradition preferred the lamentation with a crowd, or the deposition with ladders and helpers, both of which are narrative scenes with several figures. The isolated pair, mother and dead son alone, was a foreign import. So the commission handed Michelangelo a northern devotional object and asked him to make it in Italian marble at Italian scale, in the classical language he had been studying since he was 15. That is the whole formal problem of the sculpture, and it is a real one. If you make it too beautiful, you lose the grief and it becomes decoration. If you make it too harrowing, you are working in a foreign idiom in the most classically self-conscious city in the world. He went to Carrara to get the marble himself. This became his lifelong habit, and it was not normal. Most sculptors bought blocks from dealers. Michelangelo went up into the mountains north of Pisa, into the quarries, and spent weeks and sometimes months selecting stone, and later in his life quarrying it, building roads to move it, and fighting with everyone involved. The Carrara quarries are white gashes in a grey mountain, visible from a long way off, and they have been worked since Roman times. The stone that comes out of them is a very pure white marble, fine-grained, without much veining, and it can be polished to a surface that seems to admit light a little way in before returning it. That last property is why flesh carved in Carrara marble looks like flesh, and flesh carved in coarser stone looks like stone. He chose a block, had it shipped down the coast and up the Tiber, and by the end of 1498 it was in Rome, in a workshop, and he was alone with it. He was 23. He had roughly a year, and one guaranteed contract, and a promise made on his behalf that this would be the most beautiful marble in the city. Chapter 20. The problem of the two bodies. Set aside for a moment everything you know about how the finished thing looks, and consider what he had actually agreed to do. As an engineering problem, it is close to absurd. You must carve, from one block, a seated woman with a full-grown dead man lying across her lap. The dead man is the difficulty. A corpse has no structure. That is the entire point of a corpse. Every other figure in sculpture is doing something, standing, reaching, turning, and the doing gives the body a line to be organized around. A dead body has no line. It is weight distributed by gravity alone. And it must lie across a seated figure and be supported by her, and she must be able to carry it, and it must look as though she can. Now, the proportions. An adult man laid across an adult woman's lap is bigger than she is. His torso alone will span her whole width, and his legs have to go somewhere, and his head and shoulders have to go somewhere on the other side. And the whole assembly has to sit inside a shape that reads as stable and self-contained from every angle, out of a single piece of stone that cannot be added to. His solution was to cheat precisely and invisibly, and to hide the cheat under cloth. The Virgin is enormous. If you could stand her up, she would be far larger than the Christ she holds. Well over life-size, out of any human scale. Her knees are pushed wide apart, and her lap is built into a broad platform, and the whole lower half of her is a mountain of drapery, fold on fold, a mass of stone that functions structurally as a base. And because it is all cloth, you do not see it. Drapery has no expected proportions. You cannot tell that a thigh is too long if it is under 6 inches of carved wool. So the composition resolves into a rough triangle, wide and stable at the base, rising to her bowed head. The dead man is laid on the diagonal across it, his body making the one long, unbroken line in the whole work, and that line is the thing your eye follows first. His right arm hangs down and out of the triangle. It is the only element that breaks the silhouette. It hangs by its own weight, the hand open, the fingers slightly curled, and the wound in the side is just above it. That one hanging arm is the entire proof of death. Everything else in the sculpture is composed and contained and controlled. The arm is not. It is the only part of the work that has given up. He was 23, and he understood that you do not persuade someone of a death by carving a corpse. You persuade them with one arm that has stopped participating. Chapter 21. Why the Mother is Younger than the Son. The most commented on feature of the sculpture has been remarked on since it was unveiled, and people asked him about it directly. The Virgin looks about 20. Her son, dead across her lap, looks in his 30s. She is, by any reading of the story, in her late 40s or 50s. She looks younger than he does. Condivi says he raised this with Michelangelo and reports the answer. It runs, in substance, like this: that chaste women retain their freshness far longer than those who are not, and that this was all the more true of a woman in whom there had never been the least immodest desire, and that God willed her to appear so in order to show the world the purity and perpetual virginity of the Mother. And he added that no such necessity applied to the Son, who took on human flesh in its ordinary condition and aged as men age. Now, we should treat that with some care. It is a defense offered years afterward by an artist who had made a choice and then been asked to justify it, and it has the slightly over-prepared quality of an argument that has been given before. But it also sits on genuine theological ground he had been steeped in since he was 15. In the Platonic Christian framework of Ficino's circle, incorruption is a property of the soul, and the body's decay is the mark of its distance from the divine. A body free from corruption would show it by not aging. Her youth is not a comment on her chronology. It is a statement about her condition. And there is a purely artistic reason too, which is that it works. If you carve a middle-aged woman there, you get a specific event, a particular mother, at a particular hour, on a particular Friday. It becomes reportage of a death. By making her young, he removes the moment from time. It is no longer a scene from 33 years after another scene. The mother who held the infant and the mother who holds the corpse are the same age. So the two events lie on top of each other, and the work stops being about an afternoon and becomes about the whole arc at once. Look at how she is holding him, and you can see him force this. She is not clutching. There is no grip anywhere. Her right arm goes under his shoulders, but the hand does not close on him. Her left hand is open, turned upward and outward, away from the body, in a gesture that is not grief exactly, it is closer to presentation. Here, look, that open left hand is directed at you. And her face is not contorted. The northern versions of this subject give you a screaming mother. He gives you a young woman with her head inclined, her eyes lowered, entirely composed, at the precise moment before feeling arrives. Anyone who has received bad news knows that interval. There is a period, sometimes an hour, sometimes a day, in which you are calm and functional and can make telephone calls, and everyone remarks how well you are handling it. He carved that interval. Chapter 22. The Polish, the Pieta, is the most highly finished thing he ever made. That sentence carries more weight than it looks like it does, because for the following 65 years he would leave work rough, leave it unfinished, leave chisel marks standing on faces, and eventually build an entire aesthetic out of not completing things. But this one he polished until it stopped looking like stone. Finishing marble is a long descending sequence, and every stage removes the marks of the one before it. You begin with the point chisel, driven hard, knocking off mass in flakes. Then the tooth chisel, the claw, dragged across the surface in overlapping strokes to bring it near the final form, and its tracks are the parallel grooves you see on unfinished Renaissance sculpture. Then flat chisels, then rasps and files, then abrasives, coarse stone, finer stone, pumice, and at the very end, straw and the powder of the marble itself worked wet for hours. There is no shortcut and no machine. It is time and forearms. What you are doing at the final stages is closing the surface. Raw marble is faintly granular and scatters light off the top. Polished marble is smooth enough that light enters a millimeter or two, bounces around inside the crystal, and comes back diffused. It is called subsurface scattering, and it is the same optical effect that makes living skin look alive rather than like paint. He polished the two bodies until they do that, and left almost everything else less finished. And the difference is deliberate. The flesh glows slightly. The rock beneath is comparatively dull. In the chapel light, the two figures are faintly luminous against their own base. He was 24, and he had never made anything on this scale before, and he took a single block of Carrara marble and got it to imitate the behavior of skin. Now, here is the part I keep returning to. All of that labor is invisible as labor. That is precisely its aim. A perfectly finished marble surface conceals every single one of the hundreds of thousands of decisions and blows that made it. It presents itself as though it had simply always been that shape. There is no hand in it anywhere. He worked for the better part of a year to remove himself completely from the object. And then people came and looked at it and could not tell who had made it and named someone else. He had done that. He had engineered his own erasure with pumice and straw and enormous patience, and it worked exactly as designed, and when it worked it was unbearable. That is the whole of Chapter 3, restated as a technical fact. Chapter 23. The night again, from the inside. We have circled back. This is the same night as the 4th and 5th chapters, and we are going to walk through it once more now that you know the man. He is 24. His mother has been dead for 18 years. His father thinks the work he does is beneath the family and writes to him about money. His face was broken by another sculptor at 17 and never set right. He came to this city on the strength of a forgery. His first Roman commission was quietly refused and ended up in a banker's garden with its hand knocked off to look antique. And he has just finished the best thing anyone has made in Rome in living memory, and a banker had to guarantee the contract because nobody would have taken his word for it. Then a group of visitors gives it to a man from Milan in front of him, and he says nothing. So consider what he actually does about it, because it is stranger than simple pride. He does not confront them. He does not write to anyone. He does not tell the Cardinal's household or ask his patron to make a statement, all of which were available and any of which would have been normal. He waits for the building to be empty. Whatever this is, it is not a public correction. Nobody is present for it. He is not addressing the visitors from Lombardy who have gone home to Lombardy and will never learn of it. He is not addressing the Roman public who will look at the front of the sculpture and not at a band of letters running across the Virgin's chest. He is doing something to the object alone, at night, so that the object will carry the fact whether or not anybody ever reads it. I think that is closer to burial than to publication. It has the character of putting a note inside a wall. And then the choice of word, FACIEBAT, was making, not finished. Even in the act of claiming it, he declines to claim it completely. There is one more thing about the placement that is worth having. He cut the letters across the sash on her chest. Not on the base, where an inscription would conventionally go and where it would be read as a label. On the figure. The band crosses her body diagonally and the letters run along it so that the name is physically on her, part of the garment, worn. You cannot remove it without destroying the sash. It is not attached to the sculpture, it is the sculpture. He worked until it was light, or nearly light, and then he left. And as far as we can establish, he never spoke about that night to anyone at all. Everything we know about it comes from Vasari, 50 years later, reporting a thing that had become known. Which means that either it was witnessed, or, at some point in the next 5 decades, an old man told somebody. Chapter 24. What the sculptor did. He put down his tools, and by the end of the following year, he was the most talked about sculptor in Italy. The Pieta did what the contract promised. It was immediately understood by people whose whole business was looking at marble to be a thing without a rival in the city. And he was 24, and he never again had to explain who he was. I want to sit for a moment on the peculiar consequence of that, because it is the hinge on which the entire remainder of these 4 hours turns. He solved the problem of recognition at 24, permanently. From 1500 until his death in 1564, he was the most famous artist in Europe, and for most of that period he was regarded, in a phrase people used at the time, as divine. 2 biographies of him were published while he was alive, which had essentially never happened to an artist before. Popes competed for him. He was wealthy. And the recognition did not touch the thing underneath it. He went on being difficult, suspicious, and convinced he was being cheated. He went on complaining in letters about money while owning substantial property. He went on believing that other artists were conspiring against him, sometimes correctly. He went on working himself into physical ruin and eating bread at his bench and sleeping in his boots. Nothing about the fame reached the part of him that had needed to carve his name on a sash in the dark. I do not offer that as a lesson. It is not a lesson, it is just what happened, and there is a version of this observation that is glib, and I do not want to give you the glib version at this hour. Here is a more careful way to say it. The wound of that afternoon was not really about attribution. Attribution was fixed within a year and stayed fixed for 5 centuries. What he wanted was for the fact of himself to be secured, and no external event can do that, because it is not that kind of problem. It is not a shortage of evidence. Adding evidence does not resolve it. He appears at some level to have understood this, and quite quickly, which is why he stopped signing. Not because he had become humble, he was never humble, but because a man who has tried the remedy once and watched it fail to work, even when it succeeded completely, does not usually try it a second time. He got exactly what he wanted at 24, and it did not do what he had needed it to do, and he spent 65 years looking for the thing that would. Chapter 25. The block nobody could use. In 1501, he went back to Florence, and the city had a problem it had been unable to solve for 40 years. In the yard of the cathedral works, there was a block of marble lying on its side. It was enormous, somewhere over 5 meters long. It had been quarried at Carrara in about 1464 for a project to put a series of prophets high on the cathedral, and it had been badly handled from the start. A sculptor named Agostino di Duccio had begun on it and roughed out something, and stopped and gone away. 10 years later, Antonio Rossellino had been engaged and had also given up. And then it had lain in the yard in the weather for the better part of 4 decades, and the Florentines had taken to calling it the Giant. The problem was that it had been cut wrong. It was too shallow. Whoever had blocked it out had gone too far into the depth of the stone, so the remaining thickness front to back was not enough for a normal standing figure. There was reportedly a gouge taken out where the legs would have to be, and the marble itself was said to be poor, with flaws in it, having sat out in the rain and frost for 40 years. Everyone competent had looked at it. Leonardo da Vinci was in Florence and was consulted. Nothing came of it. In the summer of 1501, the cathedral authorities decided to try once more, and in August they gave it to Michelangelo. He was 26. What he did with the constraint is the thing to understand here, and it changed the subject of the sculpture. He could not carve a figure with any depth, so he carved one that stands almost flat, in a single shallow plane, with almost nothing projecting forward. The whole composition is turned sideways to the viewer's depth. The twist happens across the body, not into the stone. And the tradition for this subject was David, and the tradition was fixed. Donatello had made one, and Verrocchio had made one, and in both of them, David is a boy. standing over the severed head of Goliath after, victorious, relaxed. The head is on the ground. There was no room in the block for a severed head at the feet, and no depth for a boy standing at ease. So Michelangelo moved the moment. His David is before. Nothing has happened yet. There is no giant, no head, no blood. There is a young man standing still, with a stone in his lowered right hand, and the sling over his left shoulder, the strap running down his back. His head is turned sharply to his left, and his brow is drawn down, and he is looking at something we cannot see. The whole body is in that state that is not tension and not rest. The weight is on the right leg, the left knee slightly bent, the right hand hanging heavy and swollen with blood, the veins raised. He is completely still and completely wound. Every previous David is about the outcome. This one is about the interval before you find out. He was given the worst block in Tuscany, and the constraint made him invent the psychological subject that the age had been waiting for. Chapter 26. 18 months behind a fence. He began in September 1501 and worked until the spring of 1504. They built a wooden enclosure around the block in the cathedral yard so that nobody could see what he was doing, and he worked inside it, largely alone. He did not use the standard method, and this is worth knowing because it tells you how his mind worked. The normal professional procedure was pointing. You make a finished model, usually in clay or wax, and then transfer it to the marble by measurement, using plumb lines and calipers and a system of fixed reference points, drilling to depth all over the block and then carving away to the depths you have drilled. It is reliable and it is essentially mechanical, and it is how a workshop with assistants gets a big commission out of the door. Michelangelo, by the accounts of people who watched him, mostly did not do this. He worked from the front. Vasari describes the method and compares it to a figure being drawn up out of a bath of water. As the level drops, the highest part appears first, then the next, and the body emerges by degrees while the rest is still submerged. So he attacked the face of the block and drove inward, bringing the whole figure toward completion layer by layer, front to back, which means that at every stage he was carrying the entire three-dimensional form in his head, unverified, with no model to check against, on a block that had already been ruined once and had no margin anywhere. If he was wrong about where the shoulder was, there was no more stone. There is a description of him working from Blaise de Vigenère, a Frenchman who saw him in old age attacking a block, and who says he brought down more marble in a quarter of an hour than 3 young stonecutters could in 3 or 4, and went at it with such fury that whole pieces 3 or 4 fingers thick fell away, and that he came so close to the line that if he had gone a hair further, he risked ruining the whole thing. He was in his 60s or 70s when that was written. For 18 months, in a wooden shed in a cathedral yard, in the heat and then the cold, in marble dust that gets into the lungs, on a piece of stone that 2 men had already failed on, he cut inward toward a figure only he could see. In January 1504, they took the fence down. Chapter 27. Moving the Giant. The statue was finished, and it was in the wrong place. It weighed something like 6 tons. It was over 4 meters tall standing. It had been made in the cathedral yard, and the original plan from 40 years earlier had been to hoist it up onto a buttress high on the cathedral itself, which was now plainly ridiculous. Nobody was going to put that up on a roof. So the city convened a committee. This is one of my favorite documents from the whole period, and it survives. In January 1504, about 30 men were assembled to decide where to put it. Botticelli was there. Leonardo da Vinci was there. Filippino Lippi, Perugino, Giuliano da Sangallo, the leading architects and painters and goldsmiths of Florence. They disagreed at length, and the record of who said what still exists. Leonardo's contribution, characteristically, was that it should go under the arches of the loggia, beside the square, against the wall, in the shade, which would have put it in a covered space where it could not dominate anything. There is a long-standing suspicion, impossible to prove, that Leonardo, who disliked sculpture and probably disliked Michelangelo, was recommending that it be tucked away. In the end, they chose the most exposed position available, directly outside the entrance of the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of the government, in the open, in the main square of the city. Then they had to get it there. The distance is about half a kilometre. They took down the wall above the door of the workshop to get it out. They built a wooden frame and suspended the statue upright inside it, hanging from ropes so that it swung clear of the ground and was never resting on its own ankles, which would have snapped. The frame was mounted on greased beams, and they moved it by laying timbers in front and taking them up behind, hauling it forward with winches. It took 4 days, the 14th to the 18th of May, 1504, 40 men. Half a kilometre in 4 days. That is roughly 5 meters an hour. Picture the city during it. A 6-ton marble man hanging in a cradle, moving through the streets of Florence at a walking pace so slow it is not really walking, over 4 days, with a crowd around it the whole time. And it was guarded at night because on the first night people threw stones at it. The report says a group of young men gathered after dark and threw stones at the statue, and a guard had to be posted. Nobody knows why. Some have supposed political motive. The David was going up in front of the Republican government in the square where Savonarola had been burned 6 years earlier, and it was becoming a symbol of the Republic against the Medici and against larger powers. Others have supposed it was simply nakedness, or simply young men at night with an available target. Either way, the first response to the most famous sculpture in the world was that somebody threw a rock at it. That is worth remembering the next time anything you have made is received badly. It is an old pattern, and it has nothing to do with quality. Chapter 28. What Florence Saw in Him. The David went up in front of the palace and immediately meant something political. Florence, in 1504, was a republic, recently and precariously. It had thrown out the Medici 10 years before. It had burned Savonarola in the same square in 1498, hanged and then burned and thrown his ashes into the river. It was surrounded by larger, better armed powers, the papacy, France, Spain, the empire. Pisa was in revolt. The city was not safe, and everybody knew it. And here was a young man with a sling and no armor, looking hard at something out of frame, about to fight something much bigger than himself. They did not have to explain it to anybody. The statue was placed with its gaze directed, by most accounts, roughly toward Rome. There is an aspect of this I want to draw out because it connects to the thread we are following. The David is enormous and nude and unsigned, and it stands in the most public place in the city. It is the opposite in every way of a small line of letters cut in the dark on a sash. It is the most conspicuous object in Tuscany, and by then he did not need to put his name on it, because by 1504 everyone in Italy already knew. That is the shift. Between 1499 and 1504, the problem that had driven him into an empty church at night simply dissolved without being addressed as a side effect of doing more work. It is often like that. The thing that was unbearable at 24 is not solved at 29. It is just no longer the load-bearing wall. Something else is. What became load-bearing for him almost immediately was worse. The sense that his time was being taken from him, that he was being prevented from working, that other men with power over him were spending his life on their projects and their delays. That grievance appears around this point, and it never leaves. It runs for 60 years, through letters, contracts, poems, and flights from cities in the middle of the night. Because in March of 1505, a year after the David went up, he was summoned to Rome by a new pope, and the next 40 years of his life were about to be organized around a tomb that was never built. Chapter 29. Julius the Second. Giuliano della Rovere became pope in 1503 and took the name Julius. He was about 60. He was a physically formidable, hot-tempered, impatient man who had waited a long time for the office and had no intention of spending it quietly. He personally led armies. He wore armor in the field. He grew a beard as a sign of mourning for the loss of Bologna and refused to shave it until he had taken the city back, and he took it back. He was called, at the time and since, the warrior pope. He was also the single greatest patron of art in the history of Europe, and he was that for the same reason he was the rest of it. He wanted the largest possible version of everything, immediately. In his 10-year reign, he commissioned Bramante to demolish and rebuild St. Peter's, which had stood for over 1,000 years. He commissioned Raphael to paint the papal apartments, and he summoned Michelangelo to Rome to build him a tomb. The two men were, by every account, extremely alike, and neither of them could tolerate it in the other. Both were autocratic. Both had terrible tempers. Both were called terribile by contemporaries, which in that period did not mean bad. It meant awe-inducing, formidable, frightening to deal with. There is a story that Michelangelo, making a bronze statue of Julius for Bologna, asked whether he should put a book in the Pope's left hand, and Julius said to put a sword there instead, because he was no scholar. Their relationship over the following 8 years included at least 2 occasions on which Michelangelo left Rome without permission, which, in the case of a papal commission, was close to a criminal act, and at least one on which he was struck by the Pope with a staff, and out of it came the two things he is most famous for, and one enormous unfinished ruin. The tomb came first. In 1505, Julius commissioned it, and what he commissioned was not a tomb in any ordinary sense. It was to be freestanding, approachable from all sides, 3 stories, roughly 7 meters by 11 at the base. It was to carry something like 40 life-size or over life-size marble figures. Slaves or captives bound at the lower level, seated prophets and personifications above them, and at the top the Pope himself. 40 figures in marble by one man. Michelangelo said yes and went to Carrara and spent 8 months in the mountains selecting and quarrying stone. He wrote later that he stayed there with 2 assistants and a horse, and no provision except his food. Enormous quantities of marble were cut and shipped down to Rome and unloaded in the square in front of St. Peter's, where it lay in a great heap that people came to look at. And then Julius lost interest. Chapter 30. The marble in the square and the door. The marble sat in the piazza in front of St. Peter's through the winter of 1506, and Michelangelo could not get paid for it. He had laid out his own money on the quarrying and the shipping, which was normal, on the understanding that he would be reimbursed. He went to the Vatican repeatedly to collect. He was put off and put off again. The reason, as far as anyone can reconstruct it, is that Julius had turned his enormous attention to a different project. The rebuilding of St. Peter's itself under Bramante, which was going to consume money on a scale that made a tomb look like a detail. And there was a piece of superstition in circulation, that building your own tomb while alive was unlucky, which somebody may have encouraged. There was also Bramante. Donato Bramante was the architect of the new basilica, and, by Michelangelo's lasting conviction, the author of every misfortune that followed. Michelangelo believed for the rest of his life that Bramante had worked against him at the papal court, and had specifically engineered the business of the ceiling in order to see him fail at a medium he had not practiced since he was 14. Whether that is true is genuinely uncertain. Bramante had reasons to prefer his own faction, and there was a real rivalry. But it is also exactly the shape of thought that came naturally to a man who was, temperamentally, always about to be betrayed. The break came in April 1506. He went to the Vatican to press for the money. He was, by his own account, in a letter written years afterward, turned away at the door by a groom, and a bishop who was present objected and was told that the order came from above. He went home, sold what was in his house, told the man he was selling to that if the Pope's people came looking for him, he had gone, got on a horse, and rode out of Rome that afternoon. He did not stop until he had crossed out of papal territory. He was 31 years old, and he had just walked out on the Pope of Rome. Julius sent 5 separate briefs to the government of Florence demanding his return. The Florentine authorities, who had their own reasons for not wanting a war with the papacy over one sculptor, pressed him to go. He refused for months. He is said to have considered an offer from the Sultan in Constantinople to go and build a bridge over the Golden Horn. Eventually, a meeting was arranged on neutral ground in Bologna, which Julius had just conquered, in November 1506. Michelangelo was brought before him. Condivi's account has a prelate attempting to smooth things over by explaining that artists are ignorant men outside their art, and Julius rounding on the prelate instead and striking at him, and the sculptor being forgiven. He was made to spend the next 15 months in Bologna casting an enormous bronze statue of Julius, a medium he barely knew, which failed at the first attempt and had to be redone. 3 years later, the Bolognese pulled it down and melted it into a cannon. He got back to Rome in 1508, expecting, finally, to be allowed to carve the tomb. And Julius told him he was going to paint a ceiling. Chapter 31. A sculptor ordered to paint. He did not want to do it. That is not a later embellishment. It is in the documents. There is a letter of his from around this period in which he refers to the ceiling and says plainly that painting is not his art. He signed a contract in May 1508. In his own record of it, he wrote a note beginning with the statement that on this day he, Michelangelo, sculptor, had received a payment on account for the painting of the chapel. Sculptor. He put it in the record of the painting contract, which is a small act of insistence by a man who has been overruled. Understand the humiliation as he would have felt it. He had been in Carrara for 8 months, quarrying stone for the largest sculptural project of the age. That project had been shelved. His money had not been paid. He had been turned away at a door, chased across Italy, made to spend more than a year casting a bronze he did not want to cast, which was then destroyed. And now, instead of the tomb, he was being handed a ceiling in a medium he had left behind at 14. And it was a ceiling that nobody much cared about. The Sistine Chapel already had its important decoration. The walls had been frescoed in the 1480s by the best painters in Italy, Botticelli, Perugino, Ghirlandaio, Rosselli, with scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ. That was the program. That was what people looked at. The ceiling was a barrel vault, about 40 meters long and 13 wide, painted blue with gold stars. A night sky. Decorative. Nobody's idea of an opportunity. The original commission was correspondingly modest. The 12 apostles in the spandrels and ornamental patterns filling the rest. Michelangelo's own account, in a letter written many years later to a friend, is that he told the Pope this would come out a poor thing, and that when Julius asked why, he answered that the apostles themselves had been poor men, and that Julius then gave him a new commission and told him he could do what he liked. I would treat that story with the usual care. But something like it happened, because what got painted bears no relation to the original contract. What he painted instead was the entire beginning of the world. 9 scenes from Genesis down the spine of the vault, from the separation of light from darkness to the drunkenness of Noah. Prophets and sibyls, 7 and 5, seated in the great niches along both sides. The ancestors of Christ in the lunettes over the windows. 4 corner scenes of the salvation of Israel. And, sitting on the painted architecture between the prophets, 20 naked young men, the ignudi, holding garlands and medallions, who represent nothing anyone has ever definitively established, over 300 figures. He had asked for a sculpture commission, been refused, been handed a decorating job, and turned it into the largest single work of figure painting in the history of European art, on a surface he had to reach by climbing. Chapter 32. The Scaffold. Before the painting there was an engineering problem, and it produced the first fight. Bramante, as papal architect, was asked to build the scaffolding and proposed to hang it from the vault on ropes through holes drilled in the ceiling. Michelangelo pointed out the obvious flaw. When the painting was finished and the scaffold came down, there would be holes in the ceiling. And what did Bramante intend to do about those? By Vasari's account, Bramante had no answer, and the job was given to Michelangelo, who designed and built his own. His solution was a flying scaffold that did not touch the floor and did not hang from the vault. It was built out from the walls, springing from holes made just above the level of the windows in the sockets that already existed for the original construction. It carried a stepped wooden platform that followed the curve of the vault high up near the ceiling, spanning the width of the chapel. This mattered practically for a reason worth noting. The chapel stayed in use. It was the Pope's own chapel where the papal chapel services were held and where the conclave met. Services continued under the scaffold for 4 years. Now, the crucial point about that platform, because it corrects the single most common belief about this entire episode, he did not lie on his back. The image of Michelangelo painting the Sistine ceiling flat on his back on a plank is one of the most durable pieces of misinformation in the history of art, reinforced by a novel and a film. It is not what happened. He stood. The platform was built close under the vault, and he stood on it and worked with his head bent backward and his arm raised above him, sometimes on the flat of the vault directly overhead, sometimes on the curving sides. In some positions he would have been half kneeling or braced against the curve. But the working posture, for 4 years, was standing with his neck extended backward and his hands over his head. We know this partly from a drawing. In the margin of one of his poems from this period, he made a small sketch of himself at work, and in it he is upright, on his feet, arching backward, brush up. If you want to feel what he is describing, stand up, tilt your head back as far as it will go, raise one arm above your head, and hold a small, precise motion for 20 minutes. Then imagine doing that for most of the daylight hours, for 4 years, in a cold building in your 30s. He was 33 when he started and 37 when he finished, and it damaged him for the rest of his life. Contemporaries record that for a long time afterward he could only read a letter comfortably by holding it up above his head. Chapter 33. The Mould. The first attempt went wrong almost immediately, and it nearly ended the project. He had begun sensibly at the far end from the altar with the Noah scenes, so that his least practiced work would be the furthest from the eye of anyone entering. And he had assembled a group of assistants from Florence, painters who knew fresco because he had not done it in 20 years. Then Mould appeared. Vasari and Condivi both describe it. the plaster began to grow a whitish efflorescence that came through the paint and obscured the figures. Michelangelo concluded that the work was ruined and went to the Pope and told him he had said all along that painting was not his art. Julius sent Giuliano da Sangallo, the architect, who diagnosed it. The problem was in the intonaco, the fine top layer of plaster on which you actually paint. It is made of lime and an aggregate. In Rome, the standard aggregate was pozzolana, volcanic ash, which makes an excellent mortar but retains water. The mix was too wet, and in the cold damp of a Roman winter, it was not drying properly, and salts were being drawn to the surface as it slowly cured. Sangallo told him how to correct the mix, and the work went on. I include this partly because it is a good story, and partly for a reason that has to do with how we are told to think about genius. The most famous painting in the world nearly failed in its first months because a man used the wrong sand. Not because of a failure of vision, not because of doubt or crisis of the soul, because of the water retention properties of volcanic ash in an unheated building in January. Most of the real difficulty in most real work is like this. It is technical, unglamorous, and solvable by someone who has met the problem before, and the correct response to it is not despair, but a specific question asked of a specific person. He did despair. He went to the Pope and said it was ruined and he had known it would be. And then somebody who knew about plaster came and told him the mix was wrong and he changed the mix. The assistance, by most accounts, did not last long. He seems to have dismissed them within the first year and gone on essentially alone, with help only for the grinding of colours, the mixing of plaster, and the transfer of the cartoons. 40 meters of ceiling, 300 figures, substantially one man on a plank. Chapter 34. I have grown a goiter from this torture. Around 1509 or 1510, in the middle of it, he wrote a poem about the physical experience and sent it to a friend named Giovanni da Pistoia. It is one of the very few descriptions we have from inside a great work while it was being made. And it is not lofty. It is a comic complaint, and the comedy is the miserable kind. He says he has grown a goiter from this torture, the way water swells the cats in Lombardy or wherever it is they get them. He describes his stomach shoved up under his chin, his beard pointing at heaven, the back of his head resting on his spine, his chest like a harpy's, the brush dripping paint onto his face until it makes a rich pavement of it, his loins driven up into his belly, his backside working as a counterweight, his feet moving blindly beneath him, the skin of his front stretched long, the skin of his back bunched and creasing, and himself bent like a Syrian bow. And then, at the end, the turn. He says his judgment has gone strange and unreliable because you shoot badly through a crooked barrel. And he asks his friend to defend his dead painting and his honor because he is in a bad place, and, he says, he is no painter. In the margin of the sheet, he drew himself doing it. A thin, standing figure, arched backward, arm up, brush raised at a shape on the ceiling above. I have paraphrased rather than quoted, because the poem exists in many translations, and each translator's phrasing belongs to them. But the substance is exactly that, and the tone is exactly that. Consider what is actually being said here. At the moment of making the single most admired object in the history of Western painting, the man making it thought his work was dead, believed his own judgment had been ruined by the physical distortion of the labor, and closed by insisting that he was not a painter at all. He was, on any measure, correct about the body and wrong about everything else. And note the last line of the complaint. Not the goiter, not the paint in the eyes. The judgment. What frightened him was that the posture was bending his ability to see straight, that the crooked barrel would spoil the shot. That is the fear of a person who is deep in something long. Not that it will be hard, they have accepted hard. That the hardness is quietly deforming the faculty they need in order to know whether it is any good. If you have ever been far enough into a piece of work to lose the ability to judge it, you have been where he was, on the plank, with the paint coming down onto his face. Chapter 35. What happens to a style over 40 meters? There is something visible on that ceiling that almost nobody notices, and once you know it, you cannot stop seeing it. He painted it from the entrance end toward the altar, which means the chronology of the painting runs opposite to the chronology of the story. The last events of Genesis, Noah and the flood, were painted first, and the creation of the world was painted last. And the style changes as it goes. The Noah scenes at the far end are crowded. Many figures, relatively small, filling the field with a lot of incident. It is competent and busy, and it is recognizably the manner of the 15th century. Of the walls below. Then he took the scaffold down at about the halfway point, and for the first time walked to the floor of the chapel and looked up at what he had done from where an actual person would stand. And he found that it read as fussy. Too much, too small, too far away. Everything after that point is different. The later scenes have fewer figures, much larger. The creation of Adam has two principal figures and a piece of ground and a rush of drapery. God, dividing light from darkness, is one twisting body against nothing at all. The figures grow, the incident falls away, the compositions simplify down to enormous forms turning in empty space. You can stand in the chapel and watch a painter learn in the correct order over 4 years by walking to the other end of the room and looking. That is the whole of artistic development compressed into one surface. Not a change of belief, a change of distance. And it is the ordinary mechanism by which anyone gets better at anything. You do the work as well as you can with the understanding you have. Then you go and stand where the work will actually be received, which is not where you made it, and you see what it does from there, and then you change. He could only have learnt it by finishing half of it wrong first. There is a lesson in that which is easy to make trite, so let me put it plainly and leave it. He did not get the first half right. The first half is not bad, but it is not what he became. He got the first half done, which allowed him to see, and then the second half is the one people cross continents for. The scenes everyone knows are all from after he climbed down and looked. Chapter 36. The Hand. The most reproduced image in the history of art is a detail from near the middle of that ceiling, and it is worth describing precisely because familiarity has worn the actual thing smooth. On the left, a man lies on a slope of bare ground. He is fully formed and physically perfect, and he is not yet animate. His body has the heaviness of something not yet holding itself up. His left arm rests on his raised knee, and the hand hangs from the wrist. The index finger extended, not quite reaching. On the right, borne through the air in a rush of violet cloth, an old man with white hair wrapped around by figures, his right arm thrust out, his index finger extended toward the other, and between the two fingertips there is a gap. That gap is the whole painting. It is a few centimeters of plaster, and it is the most eloquent, empty space in European art. Every instinct in the tradition before him would have closed it. The touch is the subject. Make them touch. He did not. He painted the instant before contact, which means the painting is permanently unresolved. Nothing has happened yet. It is about to, which is, you will notice, exactly what he did with the David. Not the victory, the moment before. Not the touch, the moment before. He does this again and again. It appears to be the deepest structural preference in his imagination. Locate the point at which everything is loaded and nothing has yet occurred, and stop there. There is a much discussed observation about the shape of the mass of drapery and figures surrounding the old man, which was noted by a physician in the 1990s. That its outline corresponds rather closely to a cross-section of the human brain. Whether that was intended is unknowable, and I will not assert it. He had certainly dissected human bodies at the hospital of Santo Spirito in Florence as a young man, by arrangement with the prior, and his anatomical knowledge was exceptional. I mention it and leave it, as one should with things that cannot be settled. What can be settled is the gap. The most famous depiction of the creation of a human being shows an unfinished gesture, a reaching that has not arrived, and the man who painted it had spent his life carving figures out of blocks by removing what was not them, and would spend his last 30 years leaving them half emerged from the stone. He believed the important thing was always about to come out and had not come out yet. Chapter 37. The 31st of October, 1512. He finished, and the scaffolding came down, and on the eve of All Saints, the 31st of October, 1512, the Pope celebrated Mass in the chapel, and it was seen. 4 years and about 4 months from the contract. The response was immediate and total. Every painter in Rome came. The influence began arriving in other people's work within months. Raphael, who was at that time painting the rooms upstairs, saw it, and his figures changed. Julius died 4 months later, in February 1513, which means that the Pope, who forced the ceiling on a man who did not want to paint it, who was fought with and fled from and reconciled with, got about 16 weeks of it. Michelangelo was 37. He had produced, before turning 40, the Pieta, the David, and the Sistine ceiling. And he considered the last 20 years of his working life to have been substantially wasted because he had been prevented from carving the tomb. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is what he said. He wrote in a letter of 1542, 37 years after the commission, that he had lost his whole youth chained to this tomb. He was 57 when he wrote it. He would live another 22 years. Let me leave the ceiling with one image, and then we will go on into the long middle of the life, which is slower and harder and in some ways more interesting than the famous part. For 4 years, in a chapel in Rome, a man stood on a platform near a curved ceiling with his head bent back, alone, painting figures larger than himself that he could not step back far enough to see. He could never see the whole. He was always closer to it than any viewer would ever be. He worked at a distance of an arm's length on images designed to be read from 20 meters below. He was making something he was structurally unable to look at. And every so often he came down the ladder and walked to the far end of the room and turned around. Chapter 38. The Tragedy of the Tomb. Condivi, writing with Michelangelo at his shoulder, called it the tragedy of the tomb, and the phrase has stuck because nothing else covers it. Here is the shape of the thing, compressed. 1505, Julius commissions a freestanding 3-story tomb with about 40 marble figures. Michelangelo spends 8 months in the quarries. 1506, the project is shelved, he is not paid, he is turned away at the door, he leaves Rome. 1508 to 1512, the ceiling instead. 1513, Julius dies. His heirs draw up a new contract. The tomb is reduced, now to stand against a wall rather than free in the middle. 1516, a third contract. Reduced again. These 1532, a fourth contract. Reduced again. 1542, a fifth contract. Reduced to almost nothing, and most of the figures are now to be made by other people. 1545. What exists is installed in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, 40 years after the commission. What stands there today is a wall monument. There is an architectural frame in 3 registers. There are 6 figures, of which he carved 3, and the 2 upper ones are by assistants, and the reclining figure of Julius himself is by another hand entirely. And in the middle of the lower register, seated, more than twice life-size, is the Moses. 40 years. 5 contracts, 2 popes dead in the middle of it, and 4 more elected. A sculptor who began the project at 30 and finished it at 70. I want to be honest about the causes, because the story is usually told as pure victimhood, and it was not. Yes, he was obstructed. Successive popes pulled him off it to work on their own projects, which they were entitled to do and which he could not refuse. Julius's heirs pressed him with lawsuits and accusations that he had taken money and not delivered. And also, he accepted commissions he could not fulfill. He had, from the beginning, agreed to a workload that no individual could execute in a lifetime, and then declined, for most of his career, to work the way that would have made it possible, which was with a proper workshop of trained assistants under him. Raphael ran an enormous shop and produced accordingly. Michelangelo could not delegate. When he did delegate, at the very end, on this very monument, the results are the weakest things on it, which rather proved his point and cost him 40 years. So, the tragedy is not simply that the world stopped him, it is that his conception was too large for one man, and he would not become more than one man. That is a specific and quite common form of ruin, and it deserves naming. Not laziness, not bad luck, a standard so high that it forbids the only method by which the work could actually get done. He carried the contract for 40 years. It is in nearly every letter. It ruined his relations with the Della Rovere family, exposed him to legal jeopardy, and shadowed the whole middle of his life. And out of the wreck came the Moses, which is one of the 2 or 3 most powerful pieces of carving in existence. Chapter 39. The Moses. He is seated. He is enormous, well over life-size even seated, and he was designed to be seen from below on the 2nd story of a much larger structure, which is why his upper body is elongated and why he looks slightly compressed where he stands now, at eye level, in a church. He has a vast beard, which one hand is running into, the fingers threaded through the strands and pulling slightly. The tablets of the law are held under his right arm, tipped, almost slipping. His head is turned hard to his left leg is drawn back under the seat, and the right foot is planted. And there are horns on his head. The horns are a translation error, and they are worth a moment. The Hebrew of Exodus describes Moses coming down from Sinai with his face transformed. And the verb used relates to a root that can mean to send out rays or to grow horns. Jerome, making the Latin Vulgate, rendered it as horned. So for 1,000 years European art gave Moses horns, and Michelangelo, working in the Latin tradition, gave him 2 small ones. Now, what is he doing? He is about to stand up, or he is about to not stand up. That is the argument, and it has run for 400 years, and the sculpture will not settle it. The body is a mass of contradictory intentions. The right leg is set as though to rise, the left is tucked back, which would make rising awkward. The torso twists one way, the head snaps the other. The hand in the beard is doing something extraordinarily specific. The strands are being drawn to one side and then caught, as though a movement began and was arrested partway. Sigmund Freud wrote an essay about this figure in 1914, published anonymously at first. He visited it repeatedly over 3 weeks, made sketches, and worked out a reading from the position of the beard and the tablets. Freud's conclusion was the opposite of the traditional one. The traditional reading was that Moses has just seen the golden calf and is about to leap up in rage and smash the tablets. Freud argued from the physical evidence that the sculpture shows the instant after, that the rage came, the body began to move, the tablets started to slip, and then he mastered it and caught them, and did not rise. Not the eruption, the suppression of the eruption. Freud characteristically, then said that this made it a monument to the artist's own struggle to master himself, and to Julius's, and possibly to Freud's, and one should take that final movement with the usual caution. But look at what he identified, because it is the same thing we have been tracking all night. Not the act, the moment the act is contained. The David before the throw, the finger before the touch, Moses after the fury and before the movement that never comes. He carved over and over for 70 years the state of being about to and not yet. And he was a man who could not stop saying the cutting thing, who got his nose broken for it at 17, who fled cities in the night, and whose temper was famous across Italy. The thing he could never do in a room, he put in the marble every time. Chapter 40. The Slaves. Scattered across the 40 years of the tomb are a set of figures called the prisoners, or the slaves, and they are, for many people who see them, more affecting than the finished work. Two of them, made around 1513 for the second contract, are finished and are in Paris. One is called the Dying Slave, a young man with his head fallen back and one arm raised over it, his body in a long, soft S-curve, apparently in the act of sinking into sleep or death. The other, the rebellious slave, is twisting hard against bindings. The other four, begun around 1519 or later and abandoned, are in Florence, in the corridor leading to the David. Those four are the ones. They are unfinished, and unfinished in a very particular way. They are not blank blocks with a bit of carving. They are massive figures who are half out of the stone. A shoulder and a chest and a straining head emerge, fully modelled and finished. And then the form goes back into raw, quarried rock, still carrying the tooth marks of the claw chisel, still bearing the scars of the point. A knee comes out. A face is entirely there, and the back of the head is undifferentiated block. One of them, the Atlas, has no head at all, only a great mass of unworked stone above the shoulders where the head is still buried. They are enormous, and they lean, and walking between them in that corridor is an unsettling experience, because the room reads as full of people who are trapped. Now, the honest position on why they are unfinished is that we do not really know, and the plain explanation is probably the true one. The contract changed again, they were no longer needed, and he stopped. But the effect is unarguable, and the effect connects directly to the philosophy he was taught at 15 in the Medici garden. If the figure is already in the block, and carving is the removal of what conceals it, then an unfinished figure is not a failure. It is a figure caught mid-release. The marble is not absence of work. It is the material condition the form is escaping from. He wrote about this in his poetry, and it is one of the very few places where an artist has stated his working metaphysics directly, and it turns out to match his practice exactly. The idea recurs across the sonnets, that the best artist has no conception that a single block of marble does not already contain within itself, and that the hand which obeys the intellect is what reaches it. Put the two things together, and you get something quite bleak and quite beautiful. Every human being, under this account, is a form imperfectly released from matter. The body is the stone. Something is trying to get out, and mostly does not manage it. And what we see of one another is the part that has emerged, and the rest is still block. He made 4 of those and left them in a room, and you can walk between them. Chapter 41. The unfinished as a method. By the end of his life, the majority of his sculpture was unfinished. Count it, and the proportion is startling. Of the substantial marble works, only a handful were carried to completion. Some estimates put the unfinished at around 2/3. There is a word for it in Italian, non finito, and there has been a 400-year argument about whether it was intention, accident, or temperament. The evidence supports all 3, and the honest answer is that it changed over time. Early on, the interruptions are external and documented. Contracts cancelled, patrons dead, popes reassigning him. That accounts for a great deal of the middle period. But it does not account for the pattern continuing when nobody was interrupting him. It does not account for works begun for himself in his own house with no contract and no deadline and left. And there is a temperamental account which the people who knew him supported. Condivi and Vasari both describe a man of such intensity of conception that the executed thing could not satisfy it, and who abandoned pieces because the hand had failed the idea. He is reported to have destroyed his own work more than once. Near the end of his life, he burned a large quantity of drawings and cartoons deliberately so that nobody would see the labor behind the results. That act is well attested, and it is the same instinct as the polish on the Pieta. Remove the evidence of effort. By the last decades, something further has happened, and it is visible in the stone. The late, unfinished works are not simply stopped, they are worked in a way that seems to have given up on the smooth surface altogether. The forms are rough, the proportions distorted, the chisel marks left standing on flesh. This is where the argument for intention becomes strong. A man who could produce the surface of the Pieta at 24 and who chooses at 80 to leave a face as a set of gouges is not failing to finish. He has stopped believing in finish. And I think there is a way to say why that is coherent rather than a decline, and it takes us back to the Sash. Finish is a claim. A completed, polished, self-sufficient object asserts that it is done, that the maker got there, that the thing is achieved. FACIEBAT. He made it. The unfinished makes no such claim. It says this was in progress. FACIEBAT. The word he chose on that one night in 1499, in the only signature he ever cut, is the word his entire late practice turned into. He signed one work in his life with a verb meaning was still making, and then spent 65 years making things that were still being made. Chapter 42. Florence, the Medici Chapel, and the siege. The middle of his life is spent shuttling between 2 cities and 2 masters, and it contains one episode where his life was genuinely in danger. In 1516, a Medici became Pope, Leo X, son of the Lorenzo, at whose table he had sat as a boy. Leo pulled him off the tomb and sent him to Florence to work on the family church of San Lorenzo. A facade was designed and quarried for and never built. 3 years gone. Then the new sacristy, the Medici funerary chapel. Then the Florentine library. The Medici chapel is the one to know, because he designed the architecture and carved the sculpture, and the two are one thought. Two Medici dukes sit in niches in armor, facing each other across the room, and neither is a portrait. He is reported to have said, when this was objected to, that in 1,000 years nobody would know what they had looked like. Below them, on the curved lids of the sarcophagi, lie 4 enormous figures: day and night, dawn and dusk. They are the times of day, and they are all in various states of not being awake. Night is the famous one, a woman asleep, twisted, one arm behind her back, her head fallen onto her hand. Beneath her there is an owl, and a mask, and a bunch of poppies, which is the plant opium comes from. A poet wrote a quatrain praising her, saying that she was asleep and alive in the stone and would speak if woken. Michelangelo wrote a reply in her voice. In it, she says that sleep is dear to her, and being made of stone, dearer still, while the harm and the shame go on, that not to see and not to feel is a great good fortune to her, and therefore do not wake her, and speak softly. He wrote that during or shortly after the siege of Florence. Because in 1527 Rome was sacked by imperial troops, Florence expelled the Medici again, and the Republic came back for 3 years. And Michelangelo, whose entire career had been built on Medici patronage, took the Republic's side. He was appointed Governor-General of the fortifications. He designed earthworks for the defense of the city against the army that was coming to restore the family that had raised him. Then, in September 1529, he became convinced the city was betrayed and fled to Venice and was declared a rebel. Then he came back and resumed his post. The siege lasted 10 months, and Florence fell in August 1530. The Medici returned, and there were reprisals and executions, and Michelangelo went into hiding. Condivi says he was concealed for some weeks in the bell tower of a church or under it. Recent attention has focused on a small chamber beneath the new sacristy, discovered in 1975, whose walls are covered in charcoal drawings, and which some believe was where he hid, though this is disputed. He was pardoned. The new pope, another Medici, Clement VII, wanted the chapel finished more than he wanted the sculptor punished. So he went back to carving tombs for the family whose army he had built walls against. And on the lid of one of them he put a woman asleep, and wrote a poem in her voice, saying that not seeing and not feeling was her good fortune. And please do not wake her. He was in his mid-50s. Chapter 43. The Divine One. By the 1530s, he had become something no artist had ever been before, and the language people used about him was not the language used about craftsmen. They called him Il Divino, the Divine One. 2 full biographies appeared in his lifetime. Vasari's in 1550, which put him at the summit of the whole history of art, and made him the only living artist in the book. Then Condivi's in 1553, produced with Michelangelo's own involvement, correcting Vasari on the points Michelangelo wanted corrected, particularly about his birth, his family's gentility, and the tomb. Then Vasari's second edition, in 1568, after his death, revised in response. He was, in effect, the first artist to manage his own biography. He had a version he wanted, and he arranged for it to be written. Think about that against the Sash in the dark. At 24, he had no way to attach his name to his work except to cut it in himself at night. At 78, he commissioned a book. He was also very rich, and this is worth stating because he spent his life saying otherwise. Studies of his surviving bank records and property documents indicate he accumulated a substantial fortune: real estate in Florence and Rome, farms, investments. He died a wealthy man, and he lived like a poor one. Visitors described the house as mean, the furnishings sparse. He ate very little. His letters are an unbroken 60-year stream of complaint about money and about relatives asking for money, written by a man with money. His nephew Leonardo, in the last decades, is the recipient of most of it, and the tone is extraordinary. He writes to complain that a shipment of cheese was too generous. He rebukes him for the quality of a wine. He tells him not to write in an affectionate style because it wastes time, and he simultaneously buys him a house, arranges his marriage, and leaves him everything. There is a kind of person who is only able to express love through the management of another person's affairs, and who cannot say the plain thing, and who signs off irritably. We began tonight with a man who could not say 4 words in a church in daylight. He could not say them at 80 either, but he could buy a farm, and he could write 200 letters about the farm, and every one of them is the 4 words in a different form. Chapter 44. Vittoria Colonna. In about 1536, when he was 61, he met a woman, and it changed the last third of his life. Vittoria Colonna was a marchioness from one of the great Roman families, widowed since 1525. She was a serious poet, published and widely read, which was rare for a woman of her rank and period. And she was at the centre of a circle of reform-minded Catholics who were preoccupied with grace, faith, and the interior life, at a moment when those questions were becoming extremely dangerous to raise. They met, and they talked, and they exchanged poems and drawings for about 11 years. Until her death in 1547, there is no evidence of a romance, and it would be a distortion to describe it as one. She was in her 40s and had chosen a religious life. What the surviving material shows is something else, and rarer, and better suited to this hour. He made things for her that were not commissions. Presentation drawings, finished to an extraordinary degree in black chalk, of religious subjects, a Pieta, a crucifixion. They were gifts. There was no fee and no contract, and nobody made him do it. That is close to unique in his working life. Almost everything else he ever made was under an agreement with a patron who was harassing him about it, and they wrote to each other. His poems from this period, addressed to her or arising from her, are the best he wrote, and they are about the insufficiency of art before God, and about being old, and about love as a thing that lifts rather than consumes. She addressed him as her singular friend. In one letter she is gently exasperated with him for giving too much, and tells him he need not send anything more. He was, by every account, transformed by it. Condivi says he loved her greatly, and that she loved him, and that he was left desolate when she died. There is one detail that stays with me. Condivi reports that Michelangelo said afterward that his one regret was that when he went to see her body, he kissed her hand, but did not kiss her face. 60 years earlier, a young man stood in a chapel and could not say 4 words out loud, and went back at night with a chisel. At 72, standing beside the body of the person he had loved most in his life, he kissed her hand instead of her face, and then regretted it for the 17 years that remained. It is the same man. The gesture is always slightly withheld, and the correction always comes afterward, alone, too late, and in private. I do not tell you that to make you sad. I tell you because if you recognize it, you should know it belonged to one of the least ordinary people who ever lived, and it did not disqualify him from anything. Chapter 45. His own face in the flayed skin. Between 1536 and 1541, he painted the wall behind the altar of the Sistine Chapel. He was 61 when he began. It had been 24 years since the ceiling. The Last Judgment covers the whole end wall, about 17 meters by 13. It has upward of 300 figures and no architecture, no frame, no dividing lines. Just bodies, in a blue void, in a great slow rotation, rising on one side, falling on the other, and at the centre a young beardless Christ with his arm raised. Compare it to the ceiling, and you can see what 24 years and a sacked Rome and a Reformation did to him. The ceiling is ordered. It has a painted architecture that holds everything in place, panels, frames, seats for the prophets, a structure you can navigate. The judgment has none. The structure is gone. Bodies hang in nothing. The faces are not beautiful in the earlier way. There is a man near the bottom right being pulled down, with one hand over one eye, the other eye open, and looking at what is happening to him, and it is one of the most frightening things in painting. And somewhere below the centre, St. Bartholomew sits holding a knife in one hand, and, in the other, a limp, empty human skin, because he was flayed, and that is his attribute. The face on that skin is a distorted, sagging, ruined face, and since the 1920s it has been widely accepted as a self-portrait. He put himself in the painting as an empty hide held up by a martyr, not as a saint, not among the rising, as the part that was taken off and discarded hanging from someone else's hand, with the features slack and unrecognizable except as a likeness of himself. There is no record of him explaining it, and interpretations range from penitential self-loathing to the Platonic idea of the body as a husk the soul sheds, to the exhaustion of a man who had spent 50 years having his life removed from him in strips. I would let all three stand. The painting caused immediate trouble. The nudity was attacked, and a papal master of ceremonies named Biagio da Cesena complained that it was fit for a bathhouse rather than a chapel. Michelangelo painted him into the lower corner as Minos, judge of the underworld, with donkey's ears and a serpent, and refused to remove him. After Michelangelo's death, the Council of Trent turned against nudity in sacred art, and a painter was hired to add draperies. He is known to history as the breeches maker. Some of the additions have since been removed. Some are now considered historic in their own right and have been left. And here is the closing fact about that wall. The man who, at 24, carved his name into a sculpture so that it would be known to be his, at 65, painted his own face into the greatest fresco in Christendom as a piece of shed skin, and left it unlabeled in a corner where it took nearly 400 years for anyone to notice. Chapter 46. St. Peter's, at 71, without payment. In 1546, the architect of the new St. Peter's died, and the Pope appointed Michelangelo in his place. He was 71. He had never trained as an architect. He accepted, and he made 2 conditions, which are documented: that he would take no salary, and that he would work for the love of God and for the honor of St. Peter. He held the post for 17 years until his death, and he never took the money. The project was in a mess. It had been running for 40 years through several architects, each of whom had altered the previous design. There was a faction inside the building administration with contracts and interests, and they fought him continuously. He wrote about them with the venom he reserved for people obstructing work. What he did was go back to Bramante, the man he had blamed for the ceiling and the ruin of the tomb. Bramante's original plan had been a Greek cross, 4 equal arms under a central dome. Successive architects had complicated it. Michelangelo cut it back toward the original clarity, simplified the plan, thickened the piers to carry the load, and unified the exterior with a single giant order of pilasters running the full height. And he designed the dome. It is the largest masonry dome in the world by that measure, and it was the model for 100 capital buildings and cathedrals afterward. He did not live to see it built. It was completed in 1590, 26 years after his death, by Giacomo della Porta, who raised the profile somewhat steeper than the wooden model suggests. But it is his. I want to draw the line under this chapter carefully, because it is the resolution of something we started 4 hours ago. The most famous artist alive, in his 70s and 80s, in constant pain, worked on the largest building project in Europe without pay, on a structure he knew with certainty he would never see finished, whose completion would take a generation after his death, and which carries no signature of any kind. He wrote in that period that he took the post believing he had been placed there by God. Whether or not you share the belief, notice what it did. It gave him a way to do the largest work of his life for no credit and no money, without the arrangement feeling like a loss. If the work is owed to God, then there is nobody to be robbed by, and there is no name to attach, and the visitors from Lombardy can say whatever they like. He found, at 71, the only frame in which the wound of 24 does not operate. Not by resolving it. By moving the whole question somewhere it could not follow. Chapter 47. The Late Sonnets. He wrote poetry his whole life, and about 300 poems survive. He was a real poet, not an artist dabbling. They were circulated among people whose judgment was worth having, and Vittoria Colonna, who knew what a poem was, took them seriously. The late ones, from his 70s and 80s, are the ones for this hour. The subjects narrow. Death, which he expects continuously and which does not come. The body's decay, described with the same unsparing physical attention he gave to marble. And, repeatedly, a settling of accounts with art itself. The most quoted of them is a sonnet in which he says that the voyage of his life has reached, on a fragile boat through a stormy sea, the common harbour where every man must give account of good and evil done, and that the affectionate imagination which made art an idol and a monarch to him is now revealed as full of error, and that what all men desire against their will is now clear to him. And he turns to the God who opens his arms on the cross to receive him. That is the great renunciation poem, and it has to be read carefully. He is not saying the work was bad. He is saying he made an idol of it, that he treated the making of things as a final end, as a monarch, as the thing life was for, and that near the harbour it does not hold that weight. This from the man who made the David and the ceiling. There is another, addressed to Vasari, in which he writes about being at the end and finding neither painting nor sculpture can quiet the soul that turns toward the divine love that opened its arms to take us. We should not sentimentalize this into a deathbed conversion. He had been intensely religious for decades, driven further that way by Savonarola in his youth and by Colonna's circle in his 60s. This was a long, slow settling, not a switch. But there is something in it worth carrying to sleep, and it is not about religion. A man who by any measure achieved more in one lifetime than anyone in his field before or since, arrived at the end and concluded that he had asked the work to do something it could not do. He did not conclude the work was worthless. He concluded that he had misassigned it, that he had handed it a job, the job of justifying a life and settling the question of his own worth, which no object made of stone or plaster has ever been able to perform for anybody. That is the same discovery he was already circling at 24, in a dark church, with a chisel, cutting letters that did not fix anything. It took him 65 years to get from noticing it to saying it. Chapter 48. The Last Marble and the 18th of February. There is a sculpture in a museum in Milan called the Rondanini Pieta, and it is the last thing he touched. It is a Pieta again. The subject he had started with at 23 returned to at 88. It could not be less like the one in Rome. The Roman Pieta is a triangle, stable, polished to the point of luminosity, technically flawless, a young mother presenting a beautiful dead son with an open hand. The Rondanini is a vertical column of stone, two figures, standing rather than seated, so thin they are almost not there. The son is not lying across her lap, he is upright, in front of her, slumped. And she is behind him, holding him up, and their bodies have half merged into one another, so that it is not always possible to say where one stops. The surfaces are rough, the heads are barely indicated, it is not finished, and it never will be, and there is a detail which tells the whole story of the last years. Attached to the figure, hanging free, is a polished arm. It belongs to an earlier version. He had carved this block once already, further along, in a fuller and more conventional treatment, and then he broke it up and began again, cutting back into the stone, reducing everything, and in the process the group got thinner and the previous version was mostly destroyed. But one arm from the first attempt survives, fully worked, still attached, hanging beside the new, thin body it no longer belongs to. So you are looking at two sculptures in the same stone. The one he could make, and the one he was reaching for after he stopped believing in the first. Vasari tells us he worked on it until a few days before he died. 88 years old, standing at a block in the winter in Rome with a chisel on a work nobody had ordered, that had no patron and no fee, that he had already destroyed once, that he could not possibly complete. He fell ill in the middle of February 1564. He had a fever. He stayed on his feet for a time, and then took to his bed and dictated a short will, his soul to God, his body to the earth, his possessions to his nearest relatives. He died in the late afternoon of the 18th of February, 1564, in his house in Rome, 3 weeks short of 89. His body was taken to Florence secretly, packed in a bale to get it out of Rome, because the Romans wanted to keep him and the Florentines wanted him home. He was buried in Santa Croce, and Vasari designed the tomb. And now I will put the two ends of this together and then let you go. In 1499, a young man of 24 went into a dark church with an oil lamp, because some strangers had given his work away, and he cut his name into the marble across a woman's chest, using a verb that means was making, and he never signed anything again for the rest of his life. 65 years later, an old man stood at another Pieta, unfinished, unsigned, uncommissioned, unfinishable, and worked at it until 6 days before he died. Between those two nights there is the David, and the ceiling, and the Moses, and the dome that still stands over Rome, and none of them carries his name, and there has never been a moment since when anybody has needed to be told whose they are. He spent one night making sure he would be known. Then he spent a lifetime doing the thing that actually made him known, which was simply the work, unsigned, until the last week. You do not have to decide tonight which of those two men you are. The lamp is out, the chisel is down, the stone is still holding whatever it is holding, and it will hold it just as well while you are asleep. Sleep now.